There's a strange kind of comfort in the familiar, isn't there? A soft, well-worn path through life that promises no jagged edges, no unexpected twists, just the steady rhythm of what you know. Most of us, we spend our younger years chasing something big, something shiny, but as the seasons turn and the responsibilities pile up, that chase often narrows. We start looking for warmth, for ease, for the quiet hum of a life that asks no more than we're willing to give. We tell ourselves it's wisdom, this settling. We call it being practical, being responsible. We learn to avoid the sharp corners, the steep climbs, the places where the path disappears into the tall grass, just in case there's something unsettling on the other side. And we get good at it, too. We build ourselves little fortresses of predictability, where the biggest challenge is the morning commute or the monthly bills. We learn to confuse the absence of struggle with the presence of purpose. A man can build a whole life inside that quiet hum, believing he's got it all figured out, safe and sound. But sometimes, when the light hits just right, or the silence stretches a little too long, a whisper starts. A question: is this all there is? Is this safe path truly leading anywhere, or is it just circling back on itself year after predictable year? There was a man like that, a good man named Vince. 48 years old, his life neatly compartmentalized, like the rows of parts he handled every day on the factory floor. He wasn't one for flash or fuss. Vince worked at the old steel fabrication plant on the edge of town, the kind of place that always smelled faintly of oil and hot metal, a smell that clung to his work clothes even after Sarah had washed them twice. He'd been there since he was 20, watching the decades roll by like conveyor belts, each day a steady, grinding rhythm. You'd see Vince and you'd see a man built for hard work, solid, dependable like a well-worn wrench. His shoulders had a permanent slight stoop from years of leaning over machines, his forearms thick with muscle from lifting and maneuvering. But it was his eyes that really told the story. They were a deep, unremarkable brown, usually quiet, observant. You'd catch a flicker in them sometimes, a spark of something almost like a dream, but mostly they held a kind of gentle weariness. Not a complaining weariness, mind you. Vince wasn't a complainer. It was more a quiet exhaustion, like a man who'd carried more than his fair share for a long time without ever once thinking to put it down. His hands, though, those were the real testament. Knuckles a little gnarled, skin etched with fine lines and scars from minor brushes with grinders and presses. They were workers' hands, honest hands, always busy, always capable. He was the guy you could always count on. Needed a hand moving something heavy? Ask Vince. Needed a shift covered last minute? Vince would probably say yes, even if it meant missing something he wanted to do. He was friendly enough, polite, never raised his voice, but there was a reservedness about him. He wouldn't offer up his life story over a lunch break, kept his thoughts mostly to himself. Just listened, nodded, offered a thoughtful comment now and then. Everyone at the factory liked Vince. He was a good egg, reliable as the sunrise. His world revolved around his family and that modest, single-story house on Maple Street. It wasn't big, but it was always immaculate, the small yard neat as a pin. Sarah, his wife, a woman who had a laugh like warm sunshine, kept it that way. Their daughter, Emily, was off at state college, a bright kid, making them proud. And David, their 16-year-old son, was still at home, navigating the bumpy road of high school, all lanky limbs and a burgeoning interest in skateboards. Vince worked hard for them, for that house, for that neat yard, for the tuition bills and the grocery money. He considered it his sacred duty to keep the roof over their heads, food on the table, and a steady stream of predictability flowing through their lives. Every decision, every choice, he filtered through the lens of stability. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and Sarah was asleep beside him, Vince would lie awake and stare at the ceiling. In that deep silence, the hum of the comfortable life he'd built seemed to fade, and other noises crept in. The faint echoes of ideas he'd once had. A new way to organize the parts inventory at the factory, saving hours of wasted time. A clever little gadget that could make a tricky welding job safer. Even a wild notion of building a small community garden in that unused lot down by the creek. They were good ideas, solid ideas, practical ideas. But each time they surfaced, Vince would feel that familiar tug, the extra effort, the potential for someone to laugh, the thought of stepping out of line, disrupting the smooth, predictable flow. It felt risky, unnecessary. Why rock the boat when the water was calm? He'd tell himself it wasn't worth the hassle, that someone else would think of it, or that his job was to work, not to innovate. Stability was the goal, wasn't it? Keep the peace, keep the job, keep the family safe. That's what a responsible man did. And slowly, gently, those whispers of ambition would recede, replaced by the comforting blanket of routine, the steady hum of safety. It felt like the right choice, the smart choice, but deep down, a tiny part of him always knew he was settling. Not just for good enough, but for barely started. The very next morning, the jarring ring of his alarm clock at 5 a.m. was less a wake-up call and more a summons back to duty. Vince swung his legs out of bed, the familiar ache in his lower back a constant companion, a quiet protest against the years of bending and lifting. He moved through the pre-dawn silence of his house like a phantom, careful not to wake Sarah. A quick shave, a mug of instant coffee that tasted mostly of habit, and he was out the door. The factory floor was a symphony of industry by the time he arrived, the smell of hot metal and machine oil a second skin. Day in, day out, Vince manned his station, a press that stamped out automotive parts. He knew the machine better than he knew some of his neighbors, its quirks, its rhythms, the particular whine it made when a die was starting to dull. His hands, thick and calloused, moved with an efficiency born of 2 decades of repetition, guiding sheets of steel, pulling levers, checking tolerances. He was good at it, damn good. Reliable. He saw the flicker of respect in his foreman's eyes, the easy nods from his coworkers. It was a good, honest living providing for Sarah and the kids. Emily away at state college, her tuition a steady drain but a source of immense pride. David still at home, his teenage energy a whirlwind of Xbox and basketball, needing shoes, new clothes, the occasional 20 for a pizza with friends. The bills piled up, a constant paper reminder taped to the fridge, a subtle pressure always there, a justification for the comfortable, predictable grind. But as he worked sometimes, especially during the long, drone-like stretches of an afternoon shift, his mind would drift. He'd see a minor inefficiency, a slight adjustment to the workflow that could save minutes, maybe even an hour over the course of a week. He'd picture himself walking over to Foreman Miller's office, laying it out clear and concise. Miller would listen, maybe even nod, appreciate the initiative. But then another thought would creep in, the paperwork, the explanation, the potential for it to backfire, for him to be seen as a troublemaker, as someone who thought he knew better. And what if it didn't work? The embarrassment, the risk. It was easier, safer to just keep his head down, keep the parts moving, let someone else tackle the big ideas. Vince would take a deep breath, push the thought down, and focus on the rhythmic clang of the press. It wasn't just at work. He'd drive past the neglected lot down by the creek, the one he'd once envisioned as a community garden, now overgrown with weeds, broken glass glinting in the sun. Or he'd hear about a problem at the kids' school, something minor but fixable, and a solution would immediately form in his mind. But then the internal monologue would start up. Who are you to lead that? You're just Vince from the factory. What if you start something and it falls apart? People will talk. He feared that silent judgment, the raised eyebrows, the quiet whispers of, he tried and failed. So he'd keep quiet, telling himself it wasn't his place, that he had enough on his plate. His practical mind, his comfortable routine, always won the battle against the nagging urge to step forward. He yearned for meaningful contribution, a quiet ambition masked by practicality, but the fear of failure, of appearing foolish, kept it buried deep. He was dependable, yes, reliable, but that quiet exhaustion behind his eyes wasn't just from the long hours. It was the weight of all the things he hadn't done, all the waves he hadn't dared to make. He was living a life that was good, absolutely, but a quiet part of him, a part he rarely acknowledged, whispered that it wasn't quite his life. Not the one he'd imagined, not the one that would leave something truly lasting behind. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the hospital room always felt wrong, a sterile buzz against the quiet fading of life. Vince sat by his father's bed, the old man's hand a papery, thin weight in his own. His dad, a man who'd built houses with his bare hands, now looked like he could be blown away by a draft. They talked about simple things, the weather, David's latest baseball game, Sarah's prize-winning tomatoes. But then a few days before the end, his father's eyes, usually a cloudy gray, sharpened just a bit. "Vince," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper, each word a monumental effort. "You're a good man, good provider." A pause, then a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "But I had dreams, son. Big ones. Wanted to build that fishing lodge up north just like my granddad. Always told myself, next year, when things are easier, when I had more money, when I had more time." His gaze drifted, fixing on some unseen point in the sterile white room. Never did it, kept waiting for comfort, for it to be convenient. He turned his head slowly back to Vince, a flicker of something raw in his eyes. "Don't let your comfort stop you, Vince. Don't let it stop you from doing what you know is right." The words, spoken with such quiet desperation, landed like stones in Vince's chest. They didn't echo, they resonated deep in a place he rarely touched. He drove home that evening, the hospital smell still clinging to his clothes, the silence in the truck thick with his father's words. As he turned onto Elm Street, the setting sun cast long shadows over the old Maplewood Park. It used to be the heart of the neighborhood, a place where kids scraped knees and learned to ride bikes. Now the swings hung broken, a seesaw lay splintered, and the old picnic tables were graffitied and unstable. Overgrown bushes created dark corners, and he knew families avoided it after dusk. Just last week, David had come home with a scrape on his arm, explaining he'd been playing near the park and tripped over a loose plank from the dilapidated fence. A safety hazard, a blight. A clear, undeniable need. His father's words, "Don't let your comfort stop you from doing what you know is right," merged with the image of the derelict park, and for the first time, Vince felt a cold certainty that he had been standing still for too long. He finally made it home, the house quiet, Sarah and David asleep. The familiar comfort of his own bed felt suffocating. He lay there staring at the ceiling, the numbers on the digital clock on his nightstand glowing 3:17 a.m. 3:17, the hour of ghosts and truths. His father's face, etched with regret, floated behind his eyelids. "Don't let your comfort stop you." And the park, the splintered wood, David's scraped arm, he'd seen it. He'd known it was a problem. And what had he done? Nothing, absolutely nothing. He had always told himself he was being responsible. Practical, he was providing, keeping the boat steady. And it was true, he did provide. He worked hard, he paid the bills, his kids were in good schools. But in the stark, merciless light of 3 a.m., that comforting narrative shredded. He wasn't just staying steady, he was stagnant. He wasn't just being practical, he was being cowardly. He thought of all those buried ideas, the community garden, the factory improvement that would save hundreds of hours a month. The small inventions sketched out on grease-stained napkins tucked away in a drawer somewhere, each one a tiny grave marking a path not taken. Each one a piece of him he'd chosen not to share, not to risk. He'd convinced himself that good enough was a virtue. That stable was the ultimate goal. But tonight, stable just felt like stuck. A knot of shame tightened in his gut. He was 48 years old, and what lasting mark had he made beyond his family? What had he built for the world? What legacy was he carving out? The answer, brutal and unforgiving, was nothing. Just maintenance. Just keeping the engine running, but never driving anywhere new, never building a new road. He was so afraid of failure, he realized, so terrified of judgment, that he'd opted for invisibility. He'd chosen the quiet exhaustion of not trying over the potential exhaustion of trying and maybe falling. His father's dying regret wasn't just a lesson, it was a mirror. Vince saw himself reflected there, a man on a similar path, heading towards a similar quiet despair. The idea that his own children might one day sit by his bed and hear him lamenting a life unlived, a potential squandered for the sake of an easy chair and a predictable paycheck, struck him with a force that stole his breath. He hated that thought more than he hated any discomfort, more than he feared any failure. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the images persisted. The broken park, his father's knowing gaze, and the echoing emptiness of his own unfulfilled ambitions. It was a suffocating realization. The suffocating realization clung to him like the humid summer air. He squeezed his eyes shut tighter, as if he could banish the images, but they pulsed behind his eyelids with a relentless rhythm. The broken park, his father's knowing gaze, and the echoing emptiness of his own unfulfilled ambitions. It was a truth too stark to ignore, a weight pressing down on his chest. It had started really a few weeks before. The hospital room had smelled of antiseptic and fading hope. His father, a man who'd once moved mountains with his hands, was a shadow now, his breath shallow, his grip on Vince's hand weak as a newborn S. They'd talked about everything and nothing, the quiet conversations of men nearing the end. Then, in a moment of startling clarity, his father's eyes had locked onto his. "Vince," he'd rasped, his voice barely a whisper, I always wanted to build that boat, sail it on the lake just once." A pause, a slow blink. "Never did, always found an excuse. Too tired, too busy, too comfortable, I suppose. It's the comfort that gets you, son, lulls you to sleep. Before you know it, life's gone by, and all you've got are the things you didn't do." He'd squeezed Vince's hand again, a ghost of his old strength. "Don't let your comfort stop you from doing what you know is right." The words had hung in the air, a silent accusation. Vince had nodded, swallowed hard, promising himself he'd remember. But life, as it always did, had a way of blurring promises. Then came the park. Henderson Park, where Vince had learned to ride his bike, where Emily had scraped her knee on the monkey bars, where David, just last year, had played pickup baseball with his friends. Now the swings hung broken and rusted, the slide was cracked, splintered wood jutted from the picnic tables, and graffiti marred the old stone fountain. It had become a place of shadows and broken glass, a no-go zone. He remembered David coming home last Saturday, shoulders slumped, his usual boisterous energy gone. "Dad," he'd mumbled, kicking at a loose stone on the driveway, "we can't even play at the park anymore. It's kinda scary now." Vince had mumbled something about the city being slow, about budgets, about how things just fall apart. David had just nodded, his young eyes reflecting a disappointment that sliced deeper than Vince expected. He'd seen the same look on his father's face, the same resignation. That night, the hospital room and the broken park converged. His father's dying regret, David's quiet disappointment. Both hammered at the wall Vince had built around himself, a wall of predictable comfort. He lay in bed, the digital clock on the nightstand glowing 3:17 a.m. Sarah was a warm weight beside him, her breathing soft and even. The house was utterly silent, a familiar silence that usually lulled him back to sleep. But not tonight. Tonight, the silence was deafening, filled with the echo of his father's words, the image of David's sad eyes, and the stark reality of his own inaction. His mind was a battlefield. He stared at the ceiling, seeing not plaster, but a montage of missed opportunities. The plans for the factory floor efficiency improvement he'd sketched out, only to toss them when the company announced a new manager, and he didn't want to rock the boat. The community garden idea for the empty lot down the street, abandoned because he didn't want to be that guy who organized everything. Even that crazy idea for a simplified tool he'd had, something that could really help the mechanics in the shop, but the thought of patenting it, marketing it, putting himself out there. It had felt like too much effort, too much risk. He'd always told himself it was practicality, responsibility, that he was being smart, ensuring stability for his family. But staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling, the truth was uglier. It was fear, fear of judgment, fear of failure. Fear of the profound discomfort that came with stepping out of line, with taking a chance. He'd chosen the easy path, the well-worn groove, and in doing so, he hadn't just avoided discomfort, he'd avoided living fully. What was his legacy? A well-maintained house, a good credit score, a reputation for showing up on time and doing his job without fuss. All good things, yes, but empty of the vibrant, lasting impact he now craved, a craving he hadn't dared to acknowledge before tonight. He traded his potential for peace of mind, only to find that peace was now laced with regret. The quiet exhaustion wasn't just physical anymore, it was an exhaustion of the spirit. He felt like a man who'd spent his whole life polishing an empty frame, admiring its gleam but never putting a picture inside. He could almost hear his father's voice, a gentle rasp but piercing. "Don't let your comfort stop you from doing what you know is right." The words weren't a command, but a plea. A final, desperate warning. He closed his eyes again, but this time he wasn't trying to banish the images. He was forcing himself to see them, to feel the sharp edge of their truth. The derelict park, David's slumped shoulders, his father's frail hand. And in the silence of his own mind, a question echoed, demanding an answer. What was he going to do about it? He was tired of being the man who just watched. Tired of the quiet, comfortable grave he was digging for his own potential. The suffocating realization clung to him like the humid summer air. He squeezed his eyes shut tighter, as if he could banish the images, but they pulsed behind his eyelids with a relentless rhythm. The broken park, his father's knowing gaze, and the echoing emptiness of his own unfulfilled ambitions. It was a truth too stark to ignore, a weight pressing down on his chest. It had started really a few weeks before. The hospital room had smelled of antiseptic and fading hope. His father, a man who'd once moved mountains with his hands, was a shadow now, his breath shallow, his grip on Vince's hand weak as a newborn S. They'd talked about everything and nothing, the quiet conversations of men nearing the end. Then, in a moment of startling clarity, his father's eyes had locked onto his. "Vince," he'd rasped, his voice barely a whisper, I always wanted to build that boat. Sail it on the lake just once." A pause, a slow blink. "Never did, always found an excuse. Too tired, too busy, too comfortable, I suppose. It's the comfort that gets you, son, lulls you to sleep. Before you know it, life's gone by and all you've got are the things you didn't do." He'd squeezed Vince's hand again, a ghost of his old strength. "Don't let your comfort stop you from doing what you know is right." The words had hung in the air, a silent accusation. Vince had nodded, swallowed hard, promising himself he'd remember. But life, as it always did, had a way of blurring promises. Then came the park. Henderson Park, where Vince had learned to ride his bike, where Emily had scraped her knee on the monkey bars, where David, just last year, had played pickup baseball with his friends. Now the swings hung broken and rusted. The slide was cracked, splintered wood jutted from the picnic tables, and graffiti marred the old stone fountain. It had become a place of shadows and broken glass, a no-go zone. He remembered David coming home last Saturday, shoulders slumped, his usual boisterous energy gone. "Dad," he'd mumbled, kicking at a loose stone on the driveway, "we can't even play at the park anymore. It's kinda scary now." Vince had mumbled something about the city being slow, about budgets, about how things just fall apart. David had just nodded, his young eyes reflecting a disappointment that sliced deeper than Vince expected. He'd seen the same look on his father's face, the same resignation. That night, the hospital room and the broken park converged. His father's dying regret, David's quiet disappointment. Both hammered at the wall Vince had built around himself, a wall of predictable comfort. He lay in bed, the digital clock on the nightstand glowing 3:17 a.m. Sarah was a warm weight beside him, her breathing soft and even. The house was utterly silent, a familiar silence that usually lulled him back to sleep. But not tonight. Tonight, the silence was deafening, filled with the echo of his father's words, the image of David's sad eyes, and the stark reality of his own inaction. His mind was a battlefield. He stared at the ceiling, seeing not plaster but a montage of missed opportunities. The plans for the factory floor efficiency improvement he'd sketched out, only to toss them when the company announced a new manager and he didn't want to rock the boat. The community garden idea for the empty lot down the street, abandoned because he didn't want to be that guy who organized everything. Even that crazy idea for a simplified tool he'd had, something that could really help the mechanics in the shop, but the thought of patenting it, marketing it, putting himself out there. It had felt like too much effort, too much risk. He'd always told himself it was practicality, responsibility, that he was being smart, ensuring stability for his family. But staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling, the truth was uglier. It was fear. Fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of the profound discomfort that came with stepping out of line, with taking a chance. Chosen the easy path, the well-worn groove, and in doing so he hadn't just avoided discomfort, he'd avoided living fully. What was his legacy? A well-maintained house, a good credit score, a reputation for showing up on time and doing his job without fuss. All good things, yes, but empty of the vibrant, lasting impact he now craved, a craving he hadn't dared to acknowledge before tonight. He'd traded his potential for peace of mind, only to find that peace was now laced with regret. The quiet exhaustion wasn't just physical anymore, it was an exhaustion of the spirit. He felt like a man who'd spent his whole life polishing an empty frame, admiring its gleam but never putting a picture inside. He could almost hear his father's voice, a gentle rasp but piercing. "Don't let your comfort stop you from doing what you know is right." The words weren't a command but a plea, a final, desperate warning. He closed his eyes again, but this time he wasn't trying to banish the images. He was forcing himself to see them, to feel the sharp edge of their truth. The derelict park, David's slumped shoulders, his father's frail hand. And in the silence of his own mind, a question echoed, demanding an answer. What was he going to do about it? He was tired of being the man who just watched, tired of the quiet, comfortable grave he was digging for his own potential. He lay there, the pre-dawn quiet pressing in around him, and felt it deep in his bones. Enough. Not a shout, not a dramatic fist-pounding on the mattress, but a whisper firm as bedrock. Enough of the watching. Enough of the wishing. Enough of the comfortable cage he'd built for himself, gilded with good intentions and lined with the soft fleece of predictability. He didn't know what he was going to do, not precisely. The path ahead was dark, unknown, bristling with the thorns of effort and the cold wind of potential failure. But the path he was on, the well-trodden, safe path, had become unbearable. It was a slow suffocation, and he realized, with a jolt that cleared the fog from his mind, that he was already drowning in the very comfort he'd chased. His eyelids fluttered open. The alarm clock, a silent red glow, read 4:17 a.m. Too early for work, too late for more sleep. He slid out of bed, careful not to disturb Sarah, whose breathing was soft and even beside him. The worn carpet was cool under his bare feet, a familiar comfort he barely registered. He made his way to the kitchen, the familiar hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Poured himself a glass of water, the cold liquid a shock against his tongue. He stood by the window, gazing out at the ink-black sky, the faint promise of dawn just a smudge on the horizon. His own reflection stared back, a tired man, eyes still haunted by the phantom touch of his father's hand, the image of David's disheartened slump. The park, a blacker mass against the fading night, sat silently beyond the rooftops. He saw it not as a problem for someone else, not as a lamentable fact of urban decay, but as his problem, his responsibility, his chance. The thought settled in his gut, a cold, heavy stone, but not an unpleasant one. It was the weight of purpose. The next morning, his alarm went off at 5:00 a.m. sharp, as it always did. The familiar clang, the muscle memory of his hand reaching out to silence it. For years, this was the signal for the methodical march of his day. Shower, coffee, toast, then out the door to the factory. Today, though, it felt different. The ordinary routine, once his refuge, now felt like a set of shackles. The comfort, once a blanket, now a shroud. He went through the motions, a phantom limb guiding him, shaved, the razor a familiar rasp against his stubble, drank his coffee, savoring the bitter warmth. But his mind was elsewhere. It was at the park, envisioning the broken swings, the splintered benches, the tangled weeds that choked what should have been a vibrant green space. His stomach tightened with an unfamiliar mix of dread and determination. Just before he was about to grab his lunch pail and keys, a wave of hesitation washed over him, cold and powerful. "What are you doing, Vince? This is insane. You have a job, you have responsibilities. Who are you to think you can fix a whole park? It's too much, it's too hard, people will laugh." The old whispers, the comfortable lies, tried to lure him back into the familiar warmth of inaction. He could just go to work, pretend the idea never took root. The park would still be there, still decaying, but it wouldn't be his burden. He pictured the ease of his current path, the predictable trajectory of his day, the soft landing of another evening spent in front of the TV. It was so tempting, a sweet poison. He paused at the back door, hand on the knob. His eyes fell on the old, rusting shovel leaning against the garage wall, its blade caked with dried mud from last year's garden. It wasn't the right tool for much of what needed doing at the park, not yet. But it was a tool, a symbol. He took a deep breath, pushing down the fear, the doubt, the ingrained aversion to anything that disrupted his equilibrium. He pictured David's face again, his father's plea. And then, without another thought, before the comfortable whispers could take hold again, he unlatched the back door, stepped out into the crisp morning air, and grabbed the shovel. He didn't go to the factory. Not yet. He walked, the shovel surprisingly heavy in his hand, the few blocks to the park. The morning mist still clung to the ground, blurring the edges of the abandoned swings and the cracked asphalt paths. It looked even worse in the harsh, revealing light of the rising sun than it had in his mind's eye. A wasteland. His heart sank, a lead weight. This wasn't just a weekend project. This was a monumental task, a wilderness to reclaim. He felt the familiar surge of inadequacy, the impulse to turn around, to pretend this foolish notion never occurred. His hands, calloused from years of gripping wrenches and levers, felt suddenly soft and unskilled for this. But he remembered. Don't let your comfort stop you from doing what you know is right. Comfort had kept him small. Comfort had kept him quiet. Comfort had kept him from this very moment. He swallowed hard, the taste of metallic doubt strong in his mouth. He set his jaw. He didn't have a plan, not really. He didn't have a crew. He didn't even have a clear idea of where to start. But he had a shovel, and he had enough of doing nothing. He picked a spot right next to the dilapidated sign that once proudly declared it. Community Park, and he plunged the shovel into the thick mat of weeds, forcing the blade deep into the reluctant earth. The first uncomfortable scrape, a tiny disruption, the beginning. The sun climbed higher, relentless, baking the already cracked earth. Every swing of the shovel was a fight. The weeds weren't just weeds, they were an ancient, tangled knot, roots gripping the soil like stubborn claws. His factory work, demanding as it was, at least had a rhythm, a predictable give and take. This was a brutal, uneven battle against nature and years of neglect. Sweat stung his eyes. His breath came in ragged gasps. He found himself pausing more often, leaning on the shovel, his gaze sweeping across the vast expanse of deterioration, feeling a despair so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. By the time the first factory whistles blew, signaling his shift was starting without him, he had cleared a patch no bigger than his kitchen table. It felt insignificant, a pebble moved on a mountain. He dragged himself home, showered quickly, and drove to work, the phantom ache of the shovel still in his hands. That night he fell into bed utterly spent, not with the familiar fatigue of a day's labor, but with a bone-deep exhaustion that permeated his very soul. Day 3, the stiffness was a betrayal. His shoulders screamed, his lower back felt like a vice, and his hands were raw, blossoming with blisters beneath the hardened calluses. The temptation to just pull the blanket higher to let the world wait was a siren song. Sarah stirred beside him, sensing his unrest. "Everything all right, Vince?" She murmured, half asleep. He just grunted, not trusting his voice. He peeled himself out of bed, each movement a protest from his body. The walk to the park felt longer, the shovel heavier. He saw the small patch he'd cleared, mocking him with its pathetic size. He bent, gritted his teeth, and plunged the shovel again. Each scoop was a choice, a silent defiance against the comfort that whispered, "Just stop. It's too much. No one expects this of you." But the image of his father's regret-filled eyes burned behind his own. He couldn't stop. Not yet. Not while that quiet ambition, long buried, had finally, painstakingly stirred to life. By the end of that first week, Vince was a ghost of himself. He'd lost weight, his face was gaunt, and the exhaustion behind his eyes was no longer quiet, it was a shout. Saturday morning, David found him slumped in his armchair, staring blankly at the wall, a half-empty mug of cold coffee forgotten on the end table. "Dad, aren't you going to the park?" David's voice was laced with a hopeful expectation that Vince felt he couldn't possibly meet. Vince just sighed, a weary sound from deep within him. He'd gone every morning before work and every evening after until the light failed him. He'd scraped and pulled and dug. And still the park looked almost exactly the same. The sheer magnitude of the task had begun to crush him. He'd managed to clear a path maybe 20 feet long, but the rest of the overgrown wilderness stretched out, indifferent and unconquered. That night he lay awake, 3 a.m., the familiar dark night of the soul. He wasn't just tired, he was defeated. He could hear Sarah's soft breathing beside him, and he thought of Emily away at college and David downstairs, probably dreaming of that park, hoping for it to be something more. He felt like he was failing them, failing his father, failing himself. He saw all the years he'd spent avoiding this very feeling, this profound, gut-wrenching struggle. He'd been so good at playing it safe, at keeping his head down. And for what? So he could feel this pointless exhaustion now. The comfort he'd chased had only led him to this cliff edge of despair, where the drop was failure and the climb was impossible. He pictured the tools he'd accumulated, the old shovel, a rusty rake he'd found in the shed, a pair of worn-out work gloves. They felt pathetic. He needed a bulldozer. He needed a crew. He needed money. He had nothing but raw hands and a stubborn, fading hope. He squeezed his eyes shut, a single hot tear escaping, feeling the profound, heavy weight of his own insignificance. He wanted to quit. He wanted to go back to the safe, predictable rhythm of his old life, where the biggest challenge was a jammed machine on the assembly line, not an entire forgotten world. The temptation was overwhelming, a sweet, dark comfort promising relief. Just stop, Vince. No one will blame you. But then another image broke through the despair. David, his face alight with something Vince hadn't seen in years, the first day he'd talked about the park, a glimmer of youthful hope Vince had almost snuffed out. And his father's words echoing in the quiet of the night, not as a reprimand, but as a plea. Don't let your comfort stop you from doing what you know is right. It wasn't about comfort anymore. It was about right. It was about a promise unspoken but felt. He couldn't lie to David. He couldn't betray his father's final wisdom. He couldn't betray the man he was slowly, painfully trying to become. The next morning, his body still screamed in protest, but something in his resolve had solidified. The comfort that had once been his master was now just a distant whisper, easily ignored. He still had the shovel, and he knew with a certainty that cut through the weariness that he was going to need more than that. But for today, for this morning, he had the shovel. And he had a small patch of earth, no bigger than a rug, that he had, against all odds, managed to clear. It was a testament to nothing grand, but it was a testament to something. And he would build on it, one painful, uncomfortable scoop at a time. The battle was far from over, but he was still standing. And that, he realized, was enough for now. The second morning wasn't any easier. Each muscle fiber in Vince's back and shoulders felt like it had been individually stretched and then tied in a knot. His hands, usually toughened by years of factory work, now sported tender blisters, screaming with every grip of the shovel. He'd gone to bed early, fallen into a deep, dreamless sleep of pure exhaustion, and woken up feeling like he'd run a marathon barefoot. He still went. He had to. He poured himself another cup of coffee, black as the pre-dawn sky, and felt Sarah's warm hand on his arm as he headed out the door. "You be careful out there, Vince," she'd murmured, her eyes still heavy with sleep, but her voice laced with an unspoken concern that touched him deeper than any complaint could have. Day 3 bled into day 4, and the sheer scale of the task began to truly reveal itself. The small patch he'd cleared was just that, a patch. Beyond it, the park remained an overgrown wilderness. Thorny bushes clawed at his skin, weeds as thick as rope fought back against his shovel, and hidden rocks bruised his feet through the worn soles of his work boots. He'd spent an entire afternoon trying to dig out a stump, roots like tangled steel cables refusing to yield. Sweat stung his eyes, grit worked its way into every crevice of his body, and the sun beat down with relentless cruelty. That evening, he barely made it through dinner. David was excited about some new video game. Emily called from college, talking about her classes, but Vince could barely form a coherent sentence. He just nodded, grunted, and pushed food around his plate. The temptation to just stop was a constant hum in the background, a siren song promising rest, an end to the ache. His old, comfortable life called to him. You tried, Vince. That's enough. No one expected you to clear an entire park by yourself. It's too much. Go back to your evenings on the couch, your predictable rhythm. That's who you are. He caught a glimpse of himself in the hall mirror as he shuffled off to bed, and the man staring back was a stranger. His face was leaner, streaked with dirt, eyes bloodshot. But beneath the exhaustion, there was a flinty determination he hadn't seen in years. That was the discomfort doing its work, stripping away the layers of ease, exposing the raw bone of him. On day 7, a Saturday, the sky opened up. He'd been making slow but steady progress on an old swing-set base, trying to pry loose the rusted bolts that anchored it to the ground. The rain started as a sprinkle, then became a deluge, turning the freshly tilled earth into a muddy soup. Water streamed down his face, plastered his clothes to his body. The tools slipped in his hands, and every movement was a battle against the elements. He looked at the half-removed base, then at the sodden, ruined earth, and a choked cry of frustration escaped him. He just stood there, letting the rain wash over him, feeling utterly, profoundly defeated. "This is it," he muttered to the empty park, his voice barely audible over the drumming rain. "This is where I quit. This is where I go home, dry off, and forget all about it. It's not meant to be." He threw the wrench he was holding onto the ground, a futile gesture against the forces aligned against him. It landed with a dull thud in the mud. He turned to leave, his shoulders slumped, the weight of the impossible task crushing him. But then, through the blurring rain, he saw something. Not a grand vision, not an angel, but the small, bright red cap of a sprinkler head, half buried near the edge of his cleared patch. It was one of the many things that needed fixing, but for a split second it represented not failure, but potential. A small victory, still hidden but waiting. He stopped. He thought of his father, the weary lines on his face as he spoke of his own missed chances. He thought of David's hopeful eyes. He thought of the quiet shame that would accompany walking away from something he'd started, something that truly mattered. Comfort was a warm blanket, yes, but it was also a shroud. And he was done being buried alive. Vince turned back. He picked up the muddy wrench. The rain was still coming down, but he walked over to the stubborn swing-set base, knelt down, and started to work on those rusted bolts again. He didn't know if he could remove them, not today, not in this weather. But he knew he could try, and that, he realized, was the whole point. This wasn't about comfort anymore. This was about digging in, literally and figuratively, even when every fiber of his being screamed for him to stop. It was about earning the right to look his son in the eye and to finally live up to the unspoken legacy of a man who'd learned too late. He worked until the light faded, until he was shaking with cold and exertion, until the last bit of resolve was squeezed from him. He didn't get the bolts out, but he tried. And that night he slept a different kind of sleep, one of profound exhaustion, yes, but also of quiet, stubborn victory. The next morning, Vince woke to the usual rhythm of the factory whistle in the distance, but something felt different. His muscles screamed with a familiar ache from the plant, now amplified by the park's stubborn resistance. He rubbed his temples, already planning his attack on those bolts. The thought of spending another evening wrestling with rust didn't fill him with joy exactly, but it no longer filled him with dread either. It was just the next thing to do. He spent his lunch break on his phone, something he rarely did, looking up how to remove rusted bolts. Videos popped up, suggestions for penetrating oil, heat, percussion. He made a mental list. After work, instead of heading straight home, he made a quick stop at the hardware store, buying a small can of industrial-strength rust penetrant and a wire brush. Sarah gave him a questioning look when he walked in, but didn't say anything as he tucked the items into his work bag. He ate dinner quickly, then headed out. The park was still a gloomy, neglected patch, but the small area he'd cleared now stood out, a testament to his initial push. He poured the penetrant, let it soak, then began scrubbing. The air was cool, the setting sun painting the sky in tired hues. He worked methodically, patiently. He felt the tension in his shoulders, the grit under his nails. He felt the sheer, unglamorous effort of it all. This wasn't a sudden, grand gesture. This was the grind. Day after day, he returned. The first bolt groaned, then shifted a fraction of an inch. The next night, it gave a little more. And then, with a final, protesting shriek of metal, it broke free. Vince dropped his wrench, exhaled a cloud of mist into the cold air, and stared at the freed bolt. A small, muddy victory, but a victory nonetheless. He pulled the second, then the third, each one feeling like a major engineering triumph. The rusted skeleton of the old swing set came apart, piece by piece, until only the concrete anchors remained. Neighbors who had previously only offered quick, polite nods started to linger. Mrs. Rodriguez, walking her tiny dog, stopped and watched him clear away the broken metal. Mr. Henderson, whose house backed onto the park, leaned over his fence one evening. "You're really doing it, huh, Vince?" he grunted, a flicker of something he couldn't quite place in his eyes, surprise. Admiration? David, his son, started joining him sometimes. Not to work, not at first. Just to sit on a cleared patch of ground and scroll on his phone, a silent companion. But one afternoon, David looked up from his screen. "Dad, these broken glass bits, shouldn't we pick them up before someone gets hurt?" And then, without prompting, he started gathering pieces of jagged glass into an old coffee can Vince used for small debris. Vince just nodded, a lump forming in his throat. It wasn't just his park anymore. The physical exhaustion was still immense, but it was different now. It was a productive weariness, not the deadening fatigue of unfulfilled days. His mind, once a constant loop of anxieties and what-ifs, now hummed with practical problems. How to source materials cheaply, where to get new swings if he could find anyone to help pour a new concrete base. He found himself sketching designs for new benches on napkins during his lunch break. He was thinking in a new way. One crisp Saturday morning, Vince was struggling to pry out a particularly stubborn concrete anchor when a voice called out, "Need a hand with that, Vince?" It was Mr. Henderson, stepping through a gap in his back fence, carrying a sturdy-looking crowbar. "Saw you out here day in, day out. Figured it's about time someone joined you." That was the shift. Not a sudden, dramatic lightning bolt, but a quiet, persistent sunrise. Mr. Henderson didn't just help that day. He brought his old wheelbarrow and helped cart away debris. The next weekend, Mrs. Rodriguez showed up with a cooler of water bottles and a bag of homemade cookies. Word started to trickle through the neighborhood. "Vince is fixing up the park." Suddenly, the park wasn't just Vince's project, it was the project. Someone offered a stack of old lumber. Another neighbor, a retired carpenter, offered to help build new benches if Vince could get the wood. Vince, who usually avoided asking for help, found himself calling people, organizing. He was at the library not for a book, but researching community grants, learning the jargon, the deadlines. He was uncomfortable, pushing past the innate shyness he'd always felt about putting himself out there, but the why was too strong. His father's words echoed, no longer a lament but a quiet roar of encouragement. He spent evenings meticulously filling out grant applications, his brow furrowed, learning about nonprofit structures and community impact reports. It was dry, tedious work, far removed from the tangible satisfaction of swinging a hammer, but it was necessary. He made mistakes, sent off an application with a typo, felt his stomach clench with embarrassment, but he learned, corrected, and resubmitted. The transformation wasn't just in the park, but in Vince himself. His gait was still solid, dependable, but there was a new lightness to his step. The quiet exhaustion behind his eyes had been replaced by a different kind of tired, one that held the glint of purpose. He still looked like a man who carried burdens, but now those burdens felt shared, lighter, and for the first time in a long time, meaningful. He was leading, not just working. He was building, not just maintaining. He was, slowly but surely, forging something that would last. The park, once a symbol of neglect, was becoming a beacon of community, and Vince, the quiet factory worker, was its unexpected architect. The factory floor still claimed Vince 5 days a week, but the evenings and weekends were different. The park, once a tangle of broken swings and rusted slides, now hummed with life. New sturdy play structures stood tall, painted in bright, cheerful colors. A fresh layer of wood chips cushioned the ground beneath. Benches, built by Vince and his neighbors, offered quiet spots for parents to watch their children. The basketball court had new nets, the lines freshly painted. It was finished. One Saturday afternoon, Vince sat on one of those benches, watching David laugh as he chased a soccer ball with a group of friends. Emily was home from college, sketching in a notebook nearby, her expression soft as she observed the scene. Sarah sat beside him, her hand resting warmly on his arm. The air was filled with the joyful cacophony of childhood, a sound that had been absent from this space for too long. He looked down at his hands, calloused, scarred, but strong. They were factory hands, yes, but they had also built something else. Something for them. He remembered the countless evenings spent hunched over grant applications, the arguments with skeptical city officials, the backaches from digging post holes, the doubt that had gnawed at him in the quiet hours. Each moment of struggle, each uncomfortable conversation, each frustrating setback had been a brick laid in this new foundation. "You know," he murmured, not taking his eyes off David, "I spent so many years thinking I was smart, playing it safe, keeping things smooth." He paused, a faint smile playing on his lips, tinged with a little self-reproach. Smooth just meant I wasn't making any waves, not really building anything that lasts beyond my own four walls. Sarah squeezed his arm. "You were doing what you thought was best for us, Vince." He nodded. "I was, and there's a time for that. But there's also a time to lean into the hard stuff, the uncomfortable bits, because that's where the real building happens. That's where you leave something behind that actually matters." He looked at the vibrant park, then at his children, at Sarah. "This place," he swept a hand around, "it ain't just wood and steel. It's proof that sometimes the safest thing you can do is take a risk. The easiest path isn't always the one that leads to where you need to be." He thought of his father, the quiet regret in his eyes, the unspoken dreams he carried to his grave. Vince had picked up a different kind of hammer, built a different kind of legacy. Not a grand invention, not a fortune, but a space where joy could flourish, where connection could grow, where kids like David could feel safe and free. It wasn't just a park. It was a testament to what happens when a man finally decides that what's truly comfortable isn't the absence of struggle, but the presence of purpose. And so it is that sometimes the heaviest burden a man can carry isn't the weight of responsibility, but the lightness of unlived ambition. He learns that the ripples of his life aren't made by gliding smoothly across the surface, but by diving deep, stirring the waters, and letting the